Nice.
Catchy little tune. Will there be a version 2?
Yep.
Nice. Put a little slide in there. Nice.
Hey there, Carrie.
Hey, honey. How are you?
Awesome. So Bill's getting his stuff together down south in Arizona.
That may take a while.
It may.
Yeah.
He's got, I guess, some spotty internet. And
That's what he says.
I know.
I think he's a little soup sandwich.
Well, there's for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And we're going to take this opportunity to really make fun of him, which is great because he's not here.
Exactly. But we will see him very soon.
Yeah. So we're recording this about exactly a week before ADCC. So a week from today should be ADCC finals. Carrie and I are going to go down to Vegas as well. We're meeting, we have about 30 folks from our academy going. Yeah. So it's going to be a blast. We're looking forward to it. Seeing Bill's only been gone a couple weeks.
So already.
We'll see Bill and Olivia down there as well. So it should be fun. Bill released a podcast. Did you check that one out yet?
I didn't know he had done that because you didn't share that with me. You're a bad podcast person.
It's a creepy episode.
Okay. I like creepy.
The focus keeps coming in and out of his face, and he's
that's about right.
He's left to his own devices without anybody stopping him, so he's a little off the rails.
Olivia wasn't anywhere to be found?
No, I didn't see her in there at all.
Oh, poor thing. Okay.
Yeah, so what I thought we would do, so we're going to, within a week or so, we're going to be back up with Bill and I doing this remotely.
Yep, so you guys are stuck with me for today. No,
I'm happy to have you because it's kind of a timely subject. We had a couple folks in the academy fairly recently past the 50-year-old mark.
Yep, we had, I think, 2 this year.
2 this year.
Yep.
So we have a fair number of folks, late 40s into 50s.
Mm-hmm.
You just had your 58th birthday.
That's for sure.
In July, and I'm going to be 55 this year. So we're going to talk about all things old people doing jiu-jitsu.
I like it.
And I thought we would, since, we're both physicians as well as black belts.
Well, that's up for debate whether or not I'm actually a physician.
Let's just stop that right now. That's preposterous.
Well, some of your peers
we don't
get a little territorial.
We don't need to go down that route. They're a bunch of idiots. Yeah, all you have to see is how many patients you have, and that that kind of dispels anything.
I
right?
pay them really well.
Yeah. So, and just to, especially with Carrie and I are both on here, we need to make this very clear. This is not medical advice.
Never.
So we are not assuming the role of a personal physician for you. This is for informational purposes, so just take it that way, please. Now, you can certainly ask questions, but again, we can't give medical advice on the internet.
Exactly.
All right. So I had some ideas for where I wanted to start with this. There's so much to cover, like the physical aspects of it, the training itself, of course.
Yes.
Nutritional support, recovery, maybe some things that are supplementary that may not have as much benefit for someone younger, but may be profoundly beneficial for an older person.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think one of them, you said you had actually talked about before.
Briefly. And
so we'll touch on it briefly again today.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about some of that stuff too that's really helped me. What do you think? Let's talk about the training itself.
Okay.
So, I've talked about this before on our podcast, and we really frame this as far as allostatic load. If you guys go back and listen to an early episode, we talked about the stress cup, which is basically your body needs stressors. That's how we improve. That's what weightlifting is. That's what sauna is. That's what cold plunge is. That's what a lot of these things we do that are healthy for us are actually stressors, right? And we need those to grow, but only to a certain extent, because we need to be able to adapt to those stressors. And if you do too much, you fail to adapt and can go the wrong way and get into overtraining.
Exactly.
Especially what I forgot to do, I have myself on the camera. Sorry
it's not surprising.
Yeah, I know. Hold on.
Okay. He really loves himself, you guys, in case you didn't know.
I forgot that I'm a bad producer. It's my first time at the console here. So when Carrie's talking, I'd like to put the camera on her because you guys have just watched me on YouTube on her disembodied voice. So
I kind of like it. I think it's okay.
Okay, well, I'm going to get better at the automatic
It is.
The automatic switching.
It's okay.
Okay. So back to the stress cup thing. So if you're in your 20s or early 30s, you're probably listening to this going, you guys are, it's nonsense. This doesn't apply to me. And you're right to an extent. You have a very large, the metaphorical cup to fill.
Most of them.
Most of them do.
We assume, right? Because I think over the last few years, especially through COVID, where stressors have kind of changed, I kind of wonder about that, whether or not their stress cup is as big, just because they've had different challenges during this time in their life where us as older individuals were like, although it was an inconvenience and made us break out into Tourette's like swearing, we're just like, okay, we'll get past this, right? It's kind of that, all right, one more burden, put it on, we'll get past that. But I think there's become a fragility for some individuals within that 20 to 30-year-old, 35-year-old time frame. For some. Not necessarily the grapplers. Like, right. I think maybe they've handled it better. But some of the folks coming in, like we've seen a few younger folks come into the gym. And I just wonder how their mental health is going to improve with jiu-jitsu, because it seems like they're a little more fragile, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I know what you're saying. Well, it's a tough being, when you're coming out of your teenage years in your early 20s, it's a tough transition anyway into adulthood. So it's stressful enough. There's also something to be said for, we've seen more and more younger folks in their teens even starting to develop metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. So, that's a good point too. Maybe they're the average population. If we're talking about your average jiu-jitsu person though, they're probably self-selected to be a little bit more resilient, right? Right,
especially if they've kind of come up, right? So one of our young grapplers getting ready to go off to college, Carrie, she's a freaking rock star. She state wrestling champion, going off to college now. So she, I think, is a level above some of her peers, but for sure.
So I guess, but in generalities, though, the younger population has a larger cup to fill.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And so, but as you age, that cup becomes smaller, meaning that it takes less and less stressors from any source before it overflows. So you have to watch that day to day, like a night of bad sleep and a hangover when you're 25, come in the next morning ready to go. Where you and I, that would kind of wreck both of us for a bit.
Oh yeah, yeah, like even half a drink. Right? I think you and I have talked about this, and I don't know if we've talked about it on air, but it's been some time now since you and I have had any alcohol at all, right?
Like years.
Well, I think it's just been maybe over a year or so. Down at one of the conferences I went to, I had a drink.
Yeah, but
it was a drink, and let me tell you, that night of sleep was horrible. And so I look at it, I'm like, well, that looks tasty. I'm like, my sleep's gonna suck. I can't do it.
Yeah, because we need to manage all those sources of stress, right? And so maybe a night of bad sleep, you're not feeling well. You might, for us older folks, we might want to reconsider, not necessarily not train maybe that evening or whenever your jiu-jitsu is, but maybe purposely lighten it up a little bit. Not as heavy rounds, really pick and choose, how you're rolling. So I think managing that training volume is really important, and the recovery as well too. I think you and I both talked about, I really can't do more than 3 days a week.
Which is a little interesting, right? So when we talked yesterday about how we were going to, like what we were going to discuss today, I really liked our Friday evening ladies class. It's now just an open class for blue belts and above. But I didn't notice that was overtaxing for me. Right. So, but I also you have a different drive, right? When you go and you grapple with your with our teammates, not that you're spastic and putting it all out there, but I think maybe your intensity is a little bit different. And I'm just, I don't want to say sloth-like in my jiu-jitsu, but I'm more slow and purposeful. So I think that allows me to have an extra day where perhaps you couldn't.
Well, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And that has to do with, is how I'm training. And I've recognized in myself that going into class, I can have, sometimes I'm like, oh, I really should back off today. I know. And you get a couple rolls in, right? And then you're like, man, this is so much fun. And then someone says, hey, Chris, you want to, I never say no. And
Except me. You say no to me all the time.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. There we go.
That's not true. So, so you are much better at kind of moderating your intensity too. And so just, these are kind of take home messages for us as, older grapplers.
Yeah.
Training volume for sure. Okay. It's just not going to be the same, and that's okay. Also, you want to be recovered pretty well, because skill acquisition really is harder if your nervous system's fatigued. It's really hard to upload those new skills in motor patterns when your CNS is, your central nervous system is kind of in a fatigue state. So that's something to consider as well. Do you have anything else more to add about kind of training volume?
Not necessarily training volume, but, yesterday, all of us old folks, 50 and up, happened to show up at the same time yesterday morning, and we were having a little conversation. And one of our folks that had just turned 50 not too long ago was wondering, like, how long could they continue to do this? And just thinking about it for myself, like, I'll do it until something breaks permanently that prevents me from going back on the mats, right? And so, God forbid, that's not until I'm like 90.
Right.
But it is about training volume, training smarter, right? So, and I think most gyms are this way in that you're not there to necessarily kill your training partners, right? We all should grow, and we should all have a good intensity. So finding that balance, I think, is really important.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And, we've had some people recently, last couple of months, move back across the country trying to find other gyms. And one of the biggest things I just got feedback from one of them especially is,
Sam.
Yeah, and love you, brother.
Mm-hmm.
Miss you. But he was having some challenges with a new gym, with people thinking it's, 80cc finals, like every round.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And he's an over 40 purple belt.
Yeah.
Right. And so, this, bring that up because that kind of fits into this conversation too.
Right.
So, right. Just training smartly. And, I don't think I pull that off all the time. I try, but, I get sucked in and all of a sudden going, yep. And I'll, instead of, if I have someone that is really coming in intense, stereotypically a younger, lower belt is coming after me, and I'm black belt, and you have a little target.
And you want to put a wood to them?
Well, what I used to do, is try to escalate my intensity to meet theirs. And that's your general inclination, right? Your instinct is to do that. But now I'm finding myself purposely trying to pull back and tie them up and get into more, slow it down a little bit. In other words, take that pace of that match and put it back down to my speed.
Put it down to your speed. And I think that's perhaps it, right? So there's a couple of our grapplers, especially our upper belts, right? I'll just go ahead and dime them out. Muhammad and Brian, Big Brian, black belt Brian. They are like little whirlwinds, right? And you can readily get caught up in their speed if you don't take a moment and say, okay, no, I got to try to play my game and not play their game. And that's everyone's style, right? So everyone has a different style for their jiu-jitsu. They have different things they gravitate towards. And so as the older grappler, you got to still try to play your game as best you can within that situation.
Yeah, that's right. I try to avoid extended scrambles.
Yeah.
Right. That's usually when I would get injured too.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong about, pulling the trigger when you need to change positions or transition into something, but trying to slow it back down is pretty important.
Yeah.
Because look, I'm not trying to win any titles. I don't care about that at all. I want, like you said, I want longevity out of the sport because it's good for my physical and mental health. And so I want to keep doing it. I'm sure you're the same way.
Yeah. So I just to transition a little bit differently. So back when we lived in Baltimore, right? You worked with, I can't remember if you worked at the same nursing facility that you were doing some rotations at, Dan Senendoza.
Oh, yeah.
But he was a personal trainer. Was he a strength guy?
Oh, yeah, strongman guy.
Strongman guy,
Mm-hmm.
That's what I want to say. And so his job was actually going out to these facilities to continue to provide physical training for this population.
They're like assisted living populations.
Assisted living, right.
Yeah.
And so one of the things, and so this kind of ties into Bill's creepy little podcast that he did on pet peeves. One of my pet peeves always is, well, I'm getting older and it's some person that's barely broke 40 years old and I really want to reach across the desk and just strangle them for a minute. I'm like, you're not dead. So I guess my question for you is, if somebody's going to start down the pathway of strength or even jiu-jitsu, I don't think it's ever too old to start jiu-jitsu, but even going down the pathway of getting into some sort of physical activity, what's too old?
There is no too old. I think this, like you said, this is a great segue into, let's talk about exercise. And for our listeners who are grapplers, jiu-jitsu practitioners, the biggest question I always get is, how do I supplement my jiu-jitsu with whether cardio type, quote unquote cardio or strength training, right? And the general thing is, regardless of whether you're a grappler or not, especially if you're not, strength training is not optional for our age group. It should be like brushing your teeth, wiping your butt. I mean, it has got to be one of the biggest killers of old people is frailty, which is a combination of loss of muscle mass, loss of balance and coordination, and osteoporosis, weakening of the bones.
Yeah.
So that kills more people, the sequela or, the aftermath or the downstream effects of that. Because, if you are frail and fall, you might be done.
Yeah.
You always hear about a hip gets broken and, that's kind of it.
Right.
Right. And that is not so in general, if I had to bias my workouts as an older person to anything, it is strength training. And we can talk about what that really means. Getting on your treadmill thinking you're going to, increase your cardio for jiu-jitsu, I don't think is a good carryover as much as a good strength training program is. Because you'll get some cardio, you'll get the grappling cardio, we call it, and it's hard to translate that. I'm not saying it's not good to build an aerobic base and all those other things, but if I had to, because we have a limited amount of outside stressors we can add outside of grappling, if I had to bias one way or another for an older grappler, it'd be the strength training piece. And then everything else would be like more of a recovery, like the quote unquote, the so-called zone 2 cardio, where you can, a brisk walk where you can still have a conversational pace, a nice little hike or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. If I had to kind of, if you're asking about what should I do in addition to jiu-jitsu, you got to really be careful because you don't have much room in the cup day to day. Right.
And so, you probably brought this up in an earlier episode or two. There's just other benefits with exercising as we continue to get older, right? So I saw some articles yesterday just to see, okay, well, what's the latest information on not the pros and cons, but because they didn't say there was necessarily a con to it, but that exercise, they were doing a combination of aerobic, some strength and functional exercise, and they didn't explain what the functional exercise was, to see if that benefited executive function, right? So brain health.
Well, let's just back up a little bit. Executive function, your prefrontal cortex, basically, right? The stuff, your judgment, your insight, your decision making, things like that, right?
Right. And so there was an earlier article that said yes. Especially, it didn't seem to matter what exercise was; it was beneficial. This other one, more recent article, seemed to say there didn't seem to be any benefit. However, what we do know is that exercise increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It increases cerebral vascular flow. It increases growth hormone, right? So all of those things are beneficial for not only the physical body, right, but also good for at the cellular level, like more neuronal health. So
and mitochondrial health, even deeper
mitochondrial health, right? And so, regardless of what research may show, and I guess, and I didn't look deeply enough to see, okay, what was their statistical variance, et cetera, but there's benefit. And we need to stay active for as long as we can and try to push that pace a little bit.
Yeah, and I would be curious to look at that study design. If it's another observational study and,
Well, they looked at people, they did 2 time points. They took it out to a year and a half. They looked at 6 months and then 18 months, and they said they found no difference. I don't know what they were testing as far as like executive function and...
Oh, for executive function you're talking about.
Right. But the earlier article said, yes, there was improvement in executive function and all of those other physiological markers like BDNF, growth factor, increased cerebral vascular flow.
Yeah, in general, I'm very dubious, unfortunately, the past 4 years about what's past peer review in certain journals.
Right.
Some stuff that would just never get passed. I don't know what the editors are doing or if they have an agenda. I don't know what's going on, but I've seen very poor studies starting to get published.
Oh, yeah.
When I look at any endpoint strength and conditioning, exercise-based stuff, the cognitive function, depending on their, what was their baseline function before, how are we measuring it, reaction time, short-term memory, that kind of stuff. That's difficult to do anyway. But there's just profound benefits for strength training for maintaining muscle mass. Mm-hmm. Just maintaining muscle mass and increasing bone density alone is the juice is worth the squeeze.
Oh, for
right?
Sure.
And
for sure.
People also don't realize that muscles are an endocrine organ themselves, meaning they do secrete hormones, and people used to think they weren't,
right,
or didn't understand that. They secrete their own hormones,
right,
that profoundly affect metabolism. And the less muscle mass you have, the worse off that you are as you age, typically. And we've seen that across the board with all the surrogate markers like grip strength and things like that, as a predictor of longevity.
And the grip strength thing is interesting, and I'm going to ask a question about that in a moment. So other things that exercise does for us as we age is that it also decreases all-cause mortality, right? Decreases the risk of cardiovascular disease, decreases the risk of the metabolic syndromes as well. And they also were saying that it also decreases premature death as well. So there's a lot of, just from those small handful of benefits, like it's worth it to stay active. But back to the grip strength thing. So this is something that I found just interesting because, I'm kind of an old school physician, right? So I will put hands on a patient. I'm not choking them. So don't get it twisted, everyone, or wrist locking anybody, unless it's Bill. But when a patient comes in, like I do some basic muscle strength testing, right? To include, here's my fingers, squeeze these two, right? And almost always, I notice that my older population in general seems stronger than the lower middle age group, right? And don't get me wrong, I challenge them. Especially if they're dudes, I'm like, come on, don't be a pussy. Give me a squeeze, right? So it's just interesting that in general, it seems like grip strength is going down. I can't quantify that, right? So this is just my observation within my clinic. But what do you think that's all about?
I think it has to do with a more sedentary lifestyle in the current generations.
Yeah.
Completely. I really do. I've seen it across the board. Not only just upper body strength, metabolic health. I mean, I see people, I'm not their primary care, but just, you notice what their vitals are and what, greatly increase obesity. A lot of them are on diabetic medications in their 20s and 30s. It's just crazy. Mm-hmm. And along with that, like metabolic syndrome, diabetes is a muscle wasting disease. Yeah. It just is. Yeah. It's a chronic inflammatory condition, right? So I don't want to go off the rails on this, but so to tie it together a little bit, because we have a lot of ground to cover on this one podcast. We're not going to get so deep into every single bit of it. If I'm in my 50s, older grappler, and I want to do something outside of training as an adjunct to my jiu-jitsu, which, by the way, jiu-jitsu is a really big hit to the nervous system and musculoskeletal system, metabolic system in general, super beneficial, but you got to be careful with the overtraining piece. So I would heavily bias to maybe like a low rep, moderately heavy type of strength training program, not a bodybuilder, necessarily hypertrophy per se, because you're already doing jiu-jitsu, right?
Right.
So we're talking about that specific population, and maybe on your off days, a little recovery walks and stuff like that, I think would be really good in not getting in danger of the overtraining piece. And you're always going to have people come in and say, well, no, I do this. They'll tell you what they do.
Oh, for sure.
Well, I can do, well, good for you. But right. I mean, we're trying to make almost like a public health statement here.
Right. And, this is where, everybody has some sort of wearable, right? And they're tracking this and tracking that. And they're like, but look, I got 15,000 steps today. I'm like, thinking in my head, I'm like, and you still look like a bag of ass. So that's great, but that's not enough, right? And so we need to add those other pieces in there because, like you said, those muscles are huge endocrine organs. We get used to walking. We get accommodated to that exercise. And I believe you've talked about accommodation during exercise. And so we do have to change some things up. But walking isn't enough. And most people, when they're talking about walking, they've walked around their office or they've, spent the day shopping, right? And so that's not taxing the system. Yeah, you're putting miles on your feet, but you're not challenging the system to get the benefit that you need to.
Right. Excuse me. And I think the bar has become so low that public health officials looking at the general fitness of the United States, I mean, how many people, I would say a huge percentage, do no exercise.
Oh, yeah.
So sometimes
that's because they're walking.
I get, if that, but sometimes out of desperate, they're like, please just go do something, So the bar is so low now. Does that mean that's optimal? No, they just want them to do something, right?
Right.
But if you like you said, if you really want, you have to get some requisite intensity. And you're talking about people that aren't grapplers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we're assuming to our population that you train some type of jiu-jitsu or grappling.
Right. But that isn't so I guess what we're saying is that that's by itself, it's great, right? Because it's putting a different load on the body. But that's not enough, especially as we age. We've got to start layering in other modalities, because it's still, even in those down periods, and I wish, because this article's got to be like decades old now, and I should have looked it up. There was something about like cardiovascular health, and there's this person, they looked at people that went out and did however many miles of runs, but then they were sedentary the rest of the day, versus people that did a little something throughout the day. And I realized, we work, we don't have the opportunity to do that, but just grappling 3 days a week isn't going to be good enough as we get older. We've got to add more in.
Right. But then the double-edged sword for that is not too much.
Right. But that's where being smart and having something like, okay, here's a good strength piece to put on after that. Or here's a day that we're going to go and do some hot yoga, or do a hike, or do, a recovery walk. But we can't just hang our hat on, I've exercised this many days per week, I'm good. You've got to find your balance.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. Now, with that, because you got to give the inputs, of course, to get, and your body's got to recover from those physical inputs. And the recovery piece is pretty key.
Yeah.
Especially for older folks. What is, I think I know what the answer is for you, but let's just talk about some recovery modalities that we both think are helpful.
You mean like physical recovery modalities, like infrared, sauna, hot bath, or do you mean supplement wise?
Well, let's start with the kind of the physical modalities.
Okay. Well, and again, these are things that you've mentioned in the podcast, and we've brought up a few times for a few different things, right? So infrared therapy, like there's more and more research that comes out on that all the time. The proper timing of like hot baths or saunas or hot tubs, right? Versus doing cold immersion, like all of that is super important for helping us recover. And I know you've talked about timing of like cold therapies, right? Like that really should be in the morning, should allow your body to warm back up. And on days where I'm feeling really kind of dragged out, it's especially challenging on mornings after we've trained jiu-jitsu the night before to get in that cold tub, but I feel so much better. I have a small injury on my finger, and I don't even really know what that's from. I actually don't think it's from jiu-jitsu, but I don't know the last time that I really got injured at training, since we've been doing more of these physical modalities, right? Like almost every night we get a hot bath, right before bed. Most mornings I get in the cold tub before I head off to work. So those are super, super important, I think, for me for as part of physical recovery. And then infrared, especially for acute injuries.
Yeah, you like the light boxes like the Mito Red or the Juve and stuff like that?
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. The photobiomodulation research is really, really interesting. We've talked about this before in previous episodes, but I think, these things are a good investment, for general health in general, and usually the light boxes will have a near infrared, and they'll usually combo that with a red light, which is really, excuse me, it's really good for skin health too. So, but I think those are excellent. If you haven't listened to our previous podcast on like cold immersion, there's a bunch of them out there too. Like Huberman's done a bunch of stuff on this and had a lot of the researchers on. But the idea of morning cold immersion versus evening is we're trying to kind of bookmark our circadian rhythm, so to speak, where in the morning we have a natural cortisol release, right? In the body, excuse me, the body was trying to heat itself up. And at night, we end up in a naturally cooling cycle, as we go to sleep. So the idea of what quote unquote bookmarking it is like, we'll do cold in the morning to kind of jumpstart the body's heating response, right? To kind of be in line with the circadian rhythm. And at night, like a hot bath before bed, not only does it feel good on muscles and things like that, but it also then will kind of jumpstart that cooling phenomenon. So it's kind of in line with what our body is wanting to go into anyway, and it just kind of gives it a little kick in that direction. Mm-hmm. So that's the rationale behind that, just briefly.
Right. And what do you think about those? We got one. I don't know the last time we used it. Like those pneumatic devices, right?
So we got one around my injury, basically. Mm-hmm. Okay. They're those, you basically, looks like straight jackets for your, splints for your legs that pulses, basically put compressed air into it, and it kind of squeezes and then relaxes the limbs. The science hasn't been compelling on that.
Okay.
As far as is it really improving? I think anecdotally people say it feels good, and I think they feel, they may feel better. And if that's enough for some people, mm-hmm. I don't think there's any really strong research on recovery. What there is some good research on is that blood flow restriction training, right? Where you actually restrict blood flow and then put your muscles through a bit of work. Basically, it metabolically taxes the muscle. And I know a lot of there's a couple local physical therapists that are using it a lot for mm-hmm. For rehab as well too.
Yeah.
So it's a different application, right? Yeah. It's not the same. You're talking about the full limb link thing that you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I don't know. I think it helped. Maybe some lymphatic flow to get, as the healing process to get rid of waste products. Notice I didn't say toxins.
It's your favorite, toxins.
I hate that.
I'm going to go get a massage and get the toxins out.
Yeah, massage is wonderful, but not for that reason. So before we get into like supplementation and things you can take, part of the recovery and also part of the training thing, that we like to do, because people are always like, well, how should I stretch?
Oh yeah. Well, that's your favorite, stretching.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to stretch our way out of bad posture and bad
or increase our, flexibility with stretching. Right. So it's a semantic thing. Stretching doesn't really work. Okay. Long term. What does work is more of like, if you look at Ben Patrick's stuff like knees over toes or the functional range systems guys, we're really trying to develop strength at these end ranges. Because let's say you stretch a hamstring, and go back and there's another podcast, we talked all about this. When you stretch it to a certain length, it feels tight. That tightness is related to something called the myotatic reflex. The brain, for whatever reason, doesn't feel that is a safe position for you. And it's usually because you haven't developed strength and given the right inputs in that range of motion. Once you start developing strength in those positions, which, oh, by the way, is super important for jiu-jitsu. Mm-hmm. So this is like an injury prevention, strength training, recovery, kind of all in one. These type of low intensity type of in-range strength training, whether it's the Ben Patrick stuff, knees over toes, or the functional range systems, are really, really, especially for us older folks that, you have to use those ranges, mm-hmm. not just try to stretch into them. You actually have to use them, meaning develop strength into these end ranges for true injury prevention, because most injuries happen in jiu-jitsu muscular wise when you're at end range and you try to generate force, and your brain's like, nope,
Yep.
And it does that protective contraction, which then leads to sometimes, certainly strains, but also muscle tears in my case when I tore my adductor. And so if you start developing strength in those positions, and specifically, like I said, through any of those modalities, once you get in those positions, first of all, your brain's going to let you go further. And that's true mobility. We're actually increasing our usable range of motion, not just how far can someone pull my leg in a direction. Right. So that, as far as a recovery thing, if you're like, well, what should I do? Spend some time doing that stuff and go on to knees over toes, or really dive deep into the scientific piece of it, like a functional range conditioning program. Any of those guys.
So I know you and Professor Andrew went to a specific course. Are there other equivalent courses that other grapplers can go and take a look at so they could start some of that? Because that's not common training. And I will say, Chris makes fun of my flexibility all the time, or lack thereof. And it has gotten, I think, a lot better doing this end range strength exercises that we've been incorporating in on our Sunday afternoons. And so because not everyone has access to someone like you, where do they go find this?
So one of the, waving the flag of the functional range systems guys, they train a lot of folks, right? And they go through, Andrew and I have been through a couple of their courses. The functional range conditioning course is fantastic. It's open. You can sign up for it. And they have some virtual things where you can get all the background and some examples. It doesn't have to be in person. It actually works pretty well virtually. We went for the internal strength model that they've come up with. It's a little more deep dive, and I don't think those of you that are looking at this more peripherally don't need that. But you could look for Kinstretch, KINSTRETCH. It's their version of like kind of a yoga. And what I mean by that is it's a flow through different positions doing this type of stuff. Look that up, and there might be some practitioners that have been trained in this that will put you through some classes. You can also find a bunch of this stuff on YouTube. People kind of going through some of these sequences for hips, shoulders, and whatever. Yeah. So, it's available, but, I certainly think it's worth the money to actually go to one of those courses.
Right. And if I recall correctly, at least when you and Andrew went, there was a number of jiu-jitsu folks there, correct?
Well, a lot of the faculty are jiu-jitsu guys.
Yeah,
there sure were. For that very reason, because we get into weird positions, especially playing guard, open guard positions. We get into these weird end range positions with our legs and trying to generate force out of that. And I just can't say enough about really the hip mobility alone is worth doing this stuff.
Yeah.
Jiu-jitsu is all hips. It really is. And the more dexterous and moving through space and generating force through odd angles you can do, the more effective grappler you're going to be, the less likely you are going to be injured. And you're maintaining this type of mobility, not just flexibility, mobility into old age, which I think is the biggest thing.
It's huge, right? Because the longer you sit, the shorter those muscles get, the less flexibility we get into our tendons and ligaments. And so, it's huge.
So just a real conceptual piece on that. The body is super efficient. If you are not using something, you literally will lose it. And I mean, you'll lose the tissue that makes that movement work.
Exactly. The biggest example, right, is put a limb in a cast. 8 weeks. Look at the size difference because you're not able to use that limb. So, of course.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, we kind of talked about training volume. We talked about some of the exercise pieces. We've talked about a little bit of recovery as far as the physical modalities. So I think a good thing to get into now maybe would be to some supplementary stuff Some of it has some good research behind it. Some of it's kind of in its infancy. Not only about recovery, but even some performance type of stuff.
Yeah. And so, and this kind of goes actually back to like ligament tendon strength. So, and I had asked you, had you guys talked about this topic already? And I think you said briefly. So one of my new darlings in medicine in general is methylene blue. So for people who aren't aware of methylene blue, there was a company that came out a few years ago, and they're like, look at my little blue tongue, right? And they thought that was the coolest thing ever. And we tried those supplements for a little bit, but they had some nicotine, so your little heart couldn't take that. And no, he didn't have a heart attack. He was just really like all amped up. So anything beyond caffeine is just too much for my delicate snowflake over there. But anyways, so methylene blue as an industrial agent is used as a dye. Blue jeans, those kinds of things. As a pharmaceutical agent, I really only knew about it as something for, as a diagnostic tool within surgery, right? So, for instance, a lady that decided to have her tubes tied for sterilization, her fallopian tubes tied, then met someone else and, hey, we want to have children, so she's trying to get her tubes back together. We go into the OR, sew them back up, and then shoot some dye through, methylene blue, through the uterus to watch it float out the fallopian tubes and into the abdominal cavity, just to make sure those tubes are open. So that was my extent of methylene blue until recently.
Yeah, and when I was an intern in the ER, we talked about for methemoglobinemia, right as a higher dose as a rescue. For that kind of condition. But what's interesting now is we got behind it a little more mechanistically, and it really acts on the mitochondria. So let's talk, before we get into what methylene blue does, let's talk about the mitochondria in general.
Right. And so the most basic way that people like to describe the mitochondria is they're the powerhouses of the cell. So they're these little organelles that are within the cell itself, and their function is to produce a molecule called ATP, or basically our energy currency. And so a lot of as we all age, our cells age, and yes, they die off, but the mitochondria become less efficient. The more oxidative stress they go under, the density of mitochondria start to decrease. And when we have all of that, then we also start to lose our energy currency for the cells.
Well, and importantly, the mitochondrial system in general is our aerobic way of generating energy in an oxygen environment, as opposed to anaerobic, like glycolysis, where we're just burning glucose without.
Right.
It is so much more efficient and produces so much more adenosine triphosphate when we have oxygen present. So when we are doing stuff like zone 2 cardio and other types of cardiovascular or rolling in jiu-jitsu, we are increasing mitochondrial density, and we're increasing the number of mitochondria, number of these energy producing organelles, which is super important. Can you imagine? So an untrained person gasses really quickly. There's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is, the mitochondrial function. And unfortunately, as we age, we start to develop dysfunction in the mitochondria to the point now, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think a lot of the, when we talk about neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Lewy body, Parkinson's, all these type of neurodegenerative diseases where they really wanted to really push that whole plaque kind of hypothesis. We're really seeing a lot of, at the core of this is a mitochondrial dysfunction.
Exactly. And so they've actually looked at the use of methylene blue as an antioxidant. And so I believe we've talked about it briefly, like when we hear antioxidant, then people want to go out and buy all the antioxidants that are available online. And you need some of the oxidative stress, right? We need that to grow. So there needs to be a balance. It's when we get into that abundance of oxidative stress that things start to go awry.
Well, agreed. And I've seen, they talk about using it as an antioxidant, but I think that's missing the major mechanism.
Well, and so the article that I saw, it's working as an antioxidant within the mitochondria to help that respiratory chain work better.
Well, yeah. And I don't know if you've read this, but kind of an interesting mechanism. Before I talk about this mechanism, let me just, I'm going to nerd out just a bit because it's important. So when, basically starch, protein, and fats are our energy sources, especially, starch, which becomes glucose, fats, which become fatty acids and are broken down to acetyl-CoA, which is just, you don't need to know all this, but it's the smallest unit. Those things, when there's...
But I do know it.
I know you do. You're a biochemist. But when those are shuttled into the mitochondria under the presence of oxygen, that's where a ton of energy can be made. And the way it does this, it basically passes along, it generates electrons through these processes, and these electrons are passed through something called an electron transport chain. It's basically playing past the electron, and what this little thing does, it creates an electrochemical gradient to allow to drive ATP formation through a really cool mechanism. And you don't need to know all this stuff, but just know there's 4 or 5 of these complexes of this electron transport chain that this electron gets passed down to. Four, right.
Yeah.
And what happens is, especially the first 2 complexes, you can think of it like, we have 4 people lined up and we're passing buckets of water to put out a fire, right? Well, if the first 2 people start to falter a little bit and get tired, the whole chain gets messed up, and the end result of production of energy in this case doesn't happen. What's interesting is methylene blue will act as an intermediate carrier for this electron, kind of help bypass the first 2 things that may be failing, whether you have diabetes or any kind of metabolic dysfunction that affects the mitochondria, neurodegenerative diseases, or just aging, right? So this methylene blue bypasses some of the first 2 that seem to be the most prone to fail and deliver it directly to a later unit in the chain, thus kind of rescuing the electron transport chain. And I can tell you, those of us, in our 50s, it's not a question of if, it's you do. You do have some mitochondrial dysfunction just from being on the planet for 50-something years.
Exactly. It doesn't matter how clean your diet is. It doesn't matter how well you exercise. Doesn't matter how well you manage your stress cup. It's a product of aging. I think it's accelerated within our environment because of all of these other external sources, but it's still a product of aging.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Obviously, it's not equal. It's not like no matter what you do, it's all going to be the same. If you're in good metabolic health, you exercise regularly, you'll be in a much better position than someone that doesn't, for sure, but it's still present is my point. So that's why athletic performance, one of the reasons why it drops significantly, the gas level and all that. And my little anecdotal N of 1 test here, how long have I been on? Doing the methylene blue thing?
2 months now?
Yeah. And
2.5 months.
And Carrie's watched this at the academy. I was at the point now, I was getting really discouraged. I'd get through maybe 2 rolls after class, tough ones, right? And I would be gassed where I would have to take 1, maybe 2 more rounds off before I could roll again. And I started doing like 6 in a row.
Yeah.
Right. And that's not placebo.
No.
So to me, now, again, this is just speculation. There hasn't been enough research. We'll talk about some of the things, you got to, this isn't one of those things where if a little is good, more is better type of thing, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But, I think just me as a almost 55-year-old with certainly some mitochondrial dysfunction, it was huge for me. Whereas a younger person in good shape, I would hypothesize that they may not see the performance bump because they probably have their mitochondria are probably functioning well.
Right. And so there is, at least in the research, and the research has become much more prevalent because they really started looking at this not only for the neurodegenerative diseases, but also for those that have like traumatic brain injuries, for those that have treatment-resistant PTSD, as well as long COVID. So all neuroinflammatory disorders, right? So for people that are patients of mine, or if you've heard me talk before, you know that I think like anxiety, depression, there's a problem in the gut, and then there's also neuroinflammation that needs to be controlled.
Via the vagus nerve,
Via
basically,
the vagus nerve,
as far as that bidirectional communication.
Exactly.
So super interesting. And I don't think it's just you. I mean, I think that, for depression, anxiety, I think that whole serotonin hypothesis has really hopefully been put to bed.
Not yet.
Well, it's still in the I know.
Right, it's slowly getting there.
Well, I think the underlying phenomenon for all these things, chronic fatigue syndrome, whether you want to call it long COVID, metabolic dysfunction, Alzheimer's, all the stuff, I think a lot of it has its root with all that inflammation, oxidative stress, with a mitochondrial dysfunction, right. Because we're seeing early evidence that things like methylene blue are having a big impact.
Yep. I rarely have you start something without me trying it also. In general, I think I'm doing better overall. Also, being on regular doses of methylene blue, and methylene blue really should be dosed based on body weight. That's what some of the latest research is. We may have a fat cat jump into screen here in a few moments, folks. So she's really curious, and she may pop up.
Here she comes.
But pregnant pause, waiting for Kitty, waiting to see what she's going to destroy. So I also, and yes, it's very anecdotal, but there is research behind how that is helping with overall mitochondrial health, which helps us perform better. So we're getting better energy output, right?
Yep.
Because our mitochondria are functioning better, so we're getting better ATP. But the other thing that we're also getting, and so this is for. I was going to be really sexist and say my girl grapplers, but, I've heard Bill rag about your face, and you rag about your face also, like, oh, look at my skin. You girls. Anyways, so there's some really interesting evidence to show that at least in vitro, right, so in cell studies, they are showing that the methylene blue actually outperforms as an antioxidant for skin health. It functions better than vitamin C and vitamin A or retinol. So I thought that was really interesting when I was doing a little research on my new favorite yesterday.
Well, that's super interesting, and a lot of people will push back and like, well, you're making it sound like it's this fix everything type of thing, but I think because we have a central underlying mechanism that affects so many different parts of our metabolism in our body in general with the mitochondria, that I think it does have what we call pleiotropic effects, where many different effects.
Because it's working at the cellular level, right? And that's the next level of medicine in general,
right?
Is correcting the cells, because if we can correct the cells through lifestyle and then smart supplementation and smart nutrition, then we can live longer, healthier lives, and not just, oh, I'm going to live to be 100, but you're a drooling idiot in the corner.
Yeah.
Like, who wants to be that person?
Well, not me. So I'm sorry, I left me on the screen.
Of course you did.
I'll get this eventually. I'll switch back to you. But let's talk about this. When we look at something that hasn't been widely studied, and what I mean widely studied, of years and years and years of data over many populations, many conditions, we always look at risk benefit. when we start talking about when you have your patients, you start talking about risk benefit. From my perspective, and I want you to talk about this a little bit. I think the benefit's potentially very big, and the risk is small if you dose it well with some caveats. And let's talk about those.
With some caveats, right? So, and this is to again tie into Bill's little pet peeve thing. One of my pet peeves, and you guys have heard me say this before, is people just think supplements are this innocuous, like, oh, I could take as much as I want and there's no problem. Well, I recently ran into someone that thought they could take a particular supplement and they would be all right, but guess what? It impacted their heart. So we had to wait for that shit to get out of their system, and now they're just fine.
Well, drug interactions and stuff like that,
No,
right?
just the herb itself. They took too much.
Gotcha.
There are supplements, herbs, like they have physiological actions, which is why pharmaceutical companies are always looking at what does nature have and then how can they capitalize on it, right?
Well, many of our pharmaceuticals are derived from...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you can take too much of a supplement and it can have some serious negative side effects.
Well,
so back to the methylene blue piece, if we have to be careful, because if people are on something that is being metabolized within that same pathway.
You're talking like cytochrome P450s in our liver?
Exactly. Yep. So a lot of the SSRIs.
Well, let's break that down for people. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the model is Prozac.
Escitalopram,
all these other ones that are out there,
exactly.
not Wellbutrin, but
Wellbutrin I think is in the MAO pathway.
Yeah. But anyway,
still, like, we can't just assume that you're going to be okay with even a dosing that I would prescribe for you who's on nothing.
Right.
So, testosterone.
But I mean, I'm not on an SSRI.
Right. And so we have to understand what you're taking, and then the practitioner has to understand how these are being metabolized so that we can make sure that you're doing it in a safe fashion. Because over metabolizing or under metabolizing, like let's say your SSRI, those selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the Lexapro, etc., if that builds up in your system and we get too much serotonin, now we got something called serotonin 6 syndrome. And that's a medical emergency. Well,
that's right. And the reason why it would build up is because the same enzymes in the liver responsible for metabolizing that drug, now you take another drug that uses the same system and can have an effect on it, it's going to affect the metabolism of the other drug. So that's why, we're not giving medical advice here.
Exactly.
Right? But if you've done your due diligence, and especially if you work with like a functional medicine doctor that kind of knows what they're talking about and kind of look at your other medications you may be taking, or if you have any other things that are it's contraindicated, that is always what you should do. We're just kind of telling you our experiences and just give some information about this, because I can tell you it's profoundly affected my ability to train.
Mm-hmm.
And you said some other things that you've noticed as well since I've been taking it, like my hair is not as thin. And
oh yeah, Bill hasn't made fun of your hair in weeks.
He hadn't seen me in weeks.
Well, even before,
I know.
Like I've told you this a few times, like it looks like you're not thinning as rapidly as you were before. So,
but it comes down to mitochondria too, right? And so I think that's super, super interesting. So, and the dosing is different. I know, was it 0.4 milligrams per kilogram, if I remember, was kind of the upper limit?
Recommended dose.
For what?
That was more for the long COVID, like TBI kind of recovery piece.
Oh, like traumatic brain injury for those people who don't know.
Right. But I think you saw someplace where they were actually recommending lower. But when I heard about this, the last two of the last three lectures that I sat in on, as far as continuing education, where the methylene blue was discussed, it was at the 0.4 milligram per kilogram body weight.
Right.
And that's once a day, right?
And that's a relatively high dose.
Yeah. And the other caveat would be making sure that, you got to be relatively healthy, right? So if you're like in stage 4 kidney disease, probably, or 5 kidney disease, not a good idea to really start supplements without talking to someone.
Yeah, your nephrologist or someone that knows how this will be cleared, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really important. I've come down to, just for informational purposes, I'm taking about 20 milligrams, and we've switched over, so it's 2 1 mil droppers.
Mm-hmm.
Because you had it compounded for me first,
based on your body weight,
and then you're able to buy this pharmaceutical grade methylene blue liquid. Where did you get that from?
I went to the site itself, but the same brand. Hopefully, it hasn't been co-opted by nefarious individuals. Is available on Amazon.
Yeah,
but look for pharmaceutical grade, right? That's the key thing. And so when we talked about like peptides a few weeks ago, last month sometime, we don't want something that's research grade. That's good, not good enough,
right?
Because we don't know what other contaminants are in there. You've got to get pharmaceutical grade supplies.
And I like your point about buying directly from the manufacturer, because there's been some stuff going around on Amazon where we've heard people, nefarious actors, taking labels off of one thing and putting it on their own,
and
and passing it off as something that is pharmaceutical grade or whatever,
right?
And it isn't.
Exactly.
So I think it's always beneficial to know where you're getting this from, because they have whole protocols to test their products. So that's very important. If you were going to, work with a good doc and kind of figure out, making sure you don't have any contraindications and things like that, it is still relatively safe though.
It is for
right.
almost everyone. And so the few people where I've gotten some pushback, have been concerned about kidney health, because somewhere along the line, I'm like, your kidneys are perfectly fine.
Right.
Like, that's not a concern for you.
No, and I think this gets conflated all the time. It's just like that whole protein argument where they're like, oh, too much protein is going to cause kidney problems.
Or heart disease.
Yeah. And
don't eat red meat.
I want to get away. No, you're going to drive me crazy.
Too late.
I know. The dietary protein causing kidney problems is preposterously stupid. Now, if you already have pre-existing kidney disease and you're not clearing it as well, you do have to watch that, because that is the way you clear your nitrogen from your body, from protein and from the kidneys. But it's not a causal thing where it causes it. And so, of course, if you have what we call renal insufficiency, or your kidneys aren't working well, you got to watch a lot of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so
a lot of
stuff. So it's not that this causes any of that stuff, right? So that's something that always gets conflated, and sometimes I think purposely by or just ignorance by certain these news outlets, especially.
Well,
or some doctor pontificating about it.
Well, and again, that's so typically when we see these doctors that have a broader audience that aren't well informed, they're almost like a puppet, like someone's got their hand up their ass making them talk. I don't know where they're getting their information from, and I don't think they're actually reading it for themselves, because I think they would push back and say, no, that's not right. Yeah. Or it's right in this situation, right? And that's where a lot of things, when things get reported on the news about science, is they've removed all of the nuance that was in that research.
And context.
And just like, oh, this is going to make blue flames shoot out your ass. That's what I will say now about the methylene blue. I always forget to tell my patients, if you do decide to go down that route, no, you won't have blue flames coming out your ass. But your pee will turn a bluish green. It'll last about 24 hours. And so if you're dosing it every other day, by the end of the day after you've taken it, it should be pretty well cleared out. And then it'll start all over again the next day you take it. So
yeah, the pea color.
Yeah, don't. Yeah. It's natural. It's okay.
That's funny. So that's pretty cool. That's something that's really helped me out a lot personally. Now, let's talk about we've talked about performance enhancing stuff before, but not necessarily for older people. And that's why we brought up the methylene blue thing, because I don't think it's going to have the bang for the buck as much for someone with a healthier mitochondria.
Right.
Now, let's talk about a couple things we do to help recovery, because we beat up our muscles pretty good and our tendons really well. One of the things I like to do, and we put in our shakes in the morning, is some collagen powder and with vitamin C. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, people, again, this is where people are like, they think they get a little bit of science and they think they're fine, right? They're like, well, collagen's going to get broken down in the stomach. Is it really going to get utilized within the cells? And they've shown that time and time again. It actually does. Yes, there is some degradation within the stomach. There has to be, right? Because it's such an acidic environment. But
and we have the peptidases. We have all kinds of different proteases, basically, that break down proteins.
Right. But those collagen pieces are getting taken into the cells and being used. They have shown that. So that's really beneficial. And
Sorry, she almost hit our roadcaster there. I thought we almost lost the whole episode.
Oh, you should have seen his face,
I was
everybody.
like, no.
So the collagen with vitamin C is necessary because it does help incorporate the collagen better, but the collagen is being used, and there's a lot of research about muscle strength. And again, for my grapplers that like to look pretty, it will help with skin and hair.
Yeah. And, if you have an injury, especially like a tendon injury, with your rehab and all that, especially if you're older, the collagen's really important to give your body plenty of the building blocks to help repair that tendon. And the vitamin C, it's a cofactor, right? For production.
Exactly.
So, I don't have a whole lot of stuff that we do that I think, is like we really need to talk about for the older people. It's not a lot. It's just, hydration.
Hydration is
key.
Hydration's key for everybody.
It is,
right?
but
so they think, well, I'm getting plenty of water, but they're really only getting our water is so filtered, right? That are you getting any minerals at all? Because it's filtered from the city, and then most people again have another filtration system in their own home,
which I don't blame them.
Right, and I'm not saying that's not necessary, but just in general, our normal everyday activity, we're losing hydration. So I think people need daily electrolyte water.
Yep.
You don't have to get fancy, right? Yes, we're bougie. We buy the Element packs. And if you want to sponsor us, Element, we're out there.
No, it's great.
But it is great.
However.
But you can just get some quality sea salt, 1/8 to 1/4 of a teaspoon, and about 20 ounces of water,
and a lemon,
a lime, some orange, some cucumber, whatever the hell you want to put in there. But if you're on a fixed budget and don't want to buy packets, just use your sea salt.
There's plenty of you can go online and there's plenty of kind of recipes for electrolyte solution, but it's really important, especially after grappling. You want to help.
You have to replace that after any exercise, right? So you have your 20 ounces a day just for general hydration, and then you have your extra from sweating, from exercise, etc.
You mean the loss?
The loss.
Yeah.
Right.
I thought some people might think you're recommending 20 ounces a day to drink.
At a minimum for hydration.
A minimum, yeah.
Right. But there's extra that's required when we do exercise and sweat more, right? Matter of fact, one of the conferences that I attend a lot is under Dr. William Seeds, and he also is a firm believer that as a population, we in general are underhydrated. And that's because we're not getting the electrolytes, the minerals in our water.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we could go down that route about over-farmed soils, and we're not getting a lot of the stuff even in our food that we used to get.
Exactly.
Right. And so, it's a real problem. It's almost like to stay healthy. It's like it's like it comes at you at every corner here, trying to derail you, right?
Yeah.
Well, we've gone on pretty good here. We've gotten an hour and 15 minutes, actually.
We haven't fought at all.
We never fight. So, Carrie, do you have any other kind of, summarizing, not really summarizing, but some parting thoughts on folks? From my end, I'll say it's not too late to train. If you find the right gym, you don't need to say, well, I got to wait to get into shape to train for jiu-jitsu. You should come in. And that will be part of you getting in shape.
Right.
And it will help you mentally, physically, just the whole 9 yards, and build a great community, which is one of the pillars of health, is having a strong community.
Oh, for sure.
So I encourage all you folks that are on the fence, find a good gym and come and try it. It's also good to see some gray-haired people there when you show up, and you're like, it's probably good. Right.
Yeah. In general, it's not too late to start exercising, period. If you're interested in starting jiu-jitsu, I started when I was 49 years old, right?
And you're a black belt at 58.
And I'm a black belt now at 58.
Yeah.
And it's not too late. You can do it. You can do it safely as long as you're in a safe gym. And, I've got big props to Professor Andrew, right? So he runs a class gym and makes sure that everyone's rolling safely. And if you're not, he's going to pull you aside and he's going to talk to you about how you need to improve. And it's awesome.
And the caveat, that doesn't mean that it's not like training light. There's a time to train with intensity, but under control, like we've said many times, right?
Exactly.
And that's what we look for. It's not that you're sitting there just lazing around doing, 20% jiu-jitsu all the time, but when we are upping the intensity, it's always safe. That's the whole point.
Exactly.
Well, awesome. Thanks for coming on. Much better having you across the table than that bald knucklehead.
You've been crying yourself to sleep at night.
No, we do. We do miss him greatly.
We miss him and Olivia very much.
Yeah.
You guys are going to hopefully be back on track here pretty soon, as soon as he gets up to the 20th century or 21st century.
He assured me he already has the folks coming out to upgrade. So.
Okay. So I will be happy to fill in as long as people are okay with me filling in. And
oh, yeah.
Yeah. You are, but
Yeah. But no, you have
followers.
You have a great perspective, and I think you are looked up to, especially a lot of the ladies, and kind of inspiration for being and closing in on 60 and grappling still, and a good role model for your patients too. I think.
I hope so.
Yeah.
That's what we should be, right?
Yeah, and so to everyone, I hope to see you if you guys are going to ADCC or CJI. We're actually attending both.
We are.
It should be a lot of fun. We're having a big crew come down, like we mentioned earlier. So we'll be putting out a lot more content here. Thanks for bearing with us while we were kind of with Bill's transition down to Arizona. It just put a little wrench in the works for a little bit.
And send in your questions and comments, right? So the guys are looking at those and they will answer them. I don't know all the monikers like the grappling with, blah, blah, blah. So, look, Chris has got them written somewhere. Oh, he's looking. We're looking for a button to push.
I found the button.
Okay, we're good. All right. Y'all have a great weekend and a great week.